different things. Fourth quarter 2000 just came out. We were still trying to figure out what fourth quarter 888 and 89 meant. There were different market proposals. The one that I remember the most is from Southern Company, where in Allegheny, where they proposed a for-profit RTO, where the RTOs are for-profit, but at the same time, they also take the risk. For example, the Southern proposal at the time suggested that the RTOs will cover some of the congestion costs, which is quite different from what we see today. And so it was an interesting time when people were trying to figure out how do we figure out these markets and what's needed, what's not needed. What I'd like to be talking about today is about ancillary services. The original ancillary services were, as the name said, ancillary, and it was to support energy trading, which was also supported by capacity trading. But in the future, when you have more and more renewables, it's no longer going to be ancillary. So let's go. Okay. So there's a disclaimer. I'm not going to read it, but it's there for our own protection. And what I want to get to do today is think about ancillary services in the future and what it does to markets. I'm not going to give you any conclusions because it's an unsolved problem. If it was solved, we wouldn't be talking about this, but kind of give you some food for thought. Some of you may find it interesting and decide to go in further. Others may say, yeah, let's keep that ancillary. I got out some focus. That's all fine. But I wanted to kind of brainstorm what ancillary services would be in the future. And just to kind of give you the background, FERC defined ancillary services as services that are necessary to support the transmission of capacity and energy to inform grids, from resources to the loads while maintaining reliable operation. And this was focused on short term, more like within the day rather than long term. So let's keep that in mind, don't change that, and try to figure out what will happen to that definition or how to implement it in the future when you have a lot more renewables in the grid. So the table of contents agenda, we'll start with the background. The background will talk about the definition and the needs of ancillary services. Why ancillary services at this timing? It's ancillary, it's very small. And what are the challenges going forward that we see today? And then we'll look at a future world, call it 2050, and say, what do we see from the various studies that are looking at the future? And how do we figure out what ancillary services could be at that time, but not only from the market's perspective, but also from the developer's perspective. If you're a power plant developer and you do not know that you're gonna, or you're not certain that you're gonna recoup the cost that you invested, no one's gonna invest in it. You also have to think about the loads perspective. If the cost goes absurdly high, then the loads are going to revolt, and the state politicians or the state regulatory agencies are all going to go against whatever market decide they have. So that's going to be for discussion. In the appendix, I did include summaries of the Inflation Reduction Act because it just came out and a lot of people have been asking about it. It's not directly relevant, but it is another force that will enhance more renewables going into the future as the market evolves. So ancillary services. FERC Order 888 defined 6 ancillary services: scheduling, system control, dispatch, reactive supply and voltage control, regulation, energy imbalance, and operating reserves of spinning and non-spinning reserves. These are only the 6 that FERC says you have to include in your OATT, but there are other ancillary services such as inertia, which people don't focus on much, but ERCOT has started looking into it because ERCOT has been leading renewables. Last year, I think ERCOT, the new additions of wind and solar in ERCOT alone was bigger than the following next 5 states, so second, third, fourth, fifth. There's also a black start, which we don't cover here, but in Order 888, which came out in 1996 and had a few revisions in 88 and 89, 98 and 99. Just list these 6. The ones in italicized blue, regulation, energy imbalance, and the 2 operating reserves are largely market-based within the RTO settings today. What they do is they buy regulation. Regulation is split into the capacity portion, where you basically commit your unit to say Tomorrow, I can provide 5 megawatts of regulation and mileage, which is called upon in real time by the system operator saying, hey, the load is slightly higher than what I thought, or the renewable is coming down. So I need you to provide me with energy in real time. Energy and balance service is done through RPOs by the implementation of data and real-time markets and locational market pricing, along with other services. So that is not explicitly done, but it's done through the market mechanism. And the operating reserves, you got the spinning reserves and the non-spinning reserves. For folks who are looking at things remotely and not on WebEx, we're on page 5. Page 5 just shows a table of that I took from one of the Oregon National Lab studies. It's about 5-6 years old, so it's not the newest, but it kind of covers most of the parts. It shows what each RTO has in terms of services. You can see that regulation can be split into up and down, or it can be a single product, which covers both up and down. SPP and CalISO both have up and downs. And so the ERCOTs, these are the places where you have a lot of wind, a lot of solar, and you do need to be aware of the difference between ramping going up and ramping going down. Just as a reference point, SPP in recent years has been producing energy from wind about 30% or 35% of the annual generation. ISO is about 25%, ERCOT's about 15%. MISO is about 15% as well. The other states, New York, BJAM, and ISO rating are less than 5%. So you can see that places with renewables or high renewables or anticipated high renewables when they design the market would have up and downwards regulation separate, while the other reasons, as of today, still treat regulation up and down as one product. And then when it comes to non-spinning reserves, most of the places have 10-minute non-spinning reserves, but New England and New York ISO have longer-term 30-minute reserves that will come in after the 10-minute non-spinning reserve gets in. And the idea is that regulation is the most high-quality reserves, followed by spinning reserves, followed by non-spinning reserves with short time frame and longer time frame, so that when an event happens, those reserves in that order kicks in to relieve the event and let the system be ready for the next potential event.
Just clarification, how does it kick in? You know, is it pre-dispatched or is it automatic?
Regulation is automatic, it goes through AGC.
That's regulation.
Yes.
The other two?
The spinning reserves typically kicks in semi-automatically, depending on the size of the service. And when it does kick in, depending on the RTO, there's a minimum duration that the generator has to guarantee when it's providing spinning reserves. Same with non-spinning reserves.
So there is no additional dispatch, like you do the dispatch for normal conditions, right?
Yes.
And then you do the dispatch for preventive, you know, for N-1.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all scheduled like at the beginning of.
So the dispatch is done on a 5-minute increment. The regulation typically carries the load within that 5-minute increment dispatch. And
what happens after 5 minutes after regulation is done to guarantee like at 10 minutes that you have enough spinning, non-spinning reserves so that the load balances? Is that automated, that part?
Yes, that part is
also automated. Because there is like standby reserve in New England, the largest power plant. Mm-hmm. Is it fully on or what happens?
So the contingency reserves, which is a mix of spinning reserves and non-spinning reserves together, is typically set at about 150% of the largest contingency, depending on what that is. It's 1.5 times the biggest unit committed, or the biggest import, or sometimes transmission lines. In SPP, it's 100% of the biggest plus 50% of the second biggest. But all in all together, it's about 150%. And depending on the market, you are supposed to have at least half of it from spinning reserves and the rest from non-spinning reserves. Some markets, I think, would require 2/3 to be from spinning versus non-spinning. So spinning kicks in automatically if there's a disturbance.
So the spinning reserve has has some amount, let's say 150,
Mhm.
but the disturbance that happens, you lost something that's smaller than 150. How is that rescheduled? Or that I never know.
Oh, so if the disturbance is small, it's taken care of by regulation through agency.
Mhm. That one, yes, yeah.
And if it's bigger than that regulation capability, then spinning kicks in.
How does it kick in? Like you have this standby generator,
Mhm.
like in New England, you have Seabrook, right?
Yes,
And that's X megawatts or gigawatts. And now you have lots of some smaller generation plants and you don't need the entire.
you don't.
So who decides how much exactly?
Well, there's a merit order in the spinning that.
In the reserve also?
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
and also there's zones. So if a failure happens in one zone, you try to pick it from that zone. They got different reserve zones.
Because the reserves are not deliverable necessarily
Yes.
across to the, and that's a big conservative thing. When we have these seminars, we try to identify.
Sure.
goals. So, it's a little bit interactive. So, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
I will.
Go,
Sorry.
okay, no, go later, don't worry.
I'm just gonna jump a few slides because you talked about this.
Okay.
This slide talks about how PJM's regulations.
Okay, now we are thinking business. Okay,
How do I get rid of this guy though?
don't worry about that.
Okay, so this slide summarizes what happened in the PJM regulation. PJM has been a power flow since the 1930s. And in the 1990s, it was already a power flow. But in those days, regulation was done on a LSC basis. The LSC for the utility at the time. And those are what people refer to as the transmission zones as of today, roughly. Obviously, the utilities merged and separated, so they're not exactly. But in those days, they were looking at 1.1% of the peak load for the economic peak for regulation. And in 1998, they split regulation into two types. Regulation A for the slow steam turbines, and this was done at cost. So how much fuel you use. And regulation B for hydro. Hydro had a much faster spin. I'm gonna distribute this so you don't have to take pictures. Hydro had a much faster response. And in the case of hydro, because the cost was unclear, what they defined for hydro is opportunity cost, which would be typically the cost of the steam turbines. Gas turbine technologies such as peakers or combined cycles at those days were still too expensive to provide regulation, so it was limited to steam turbines and hydro. But it was all cost-based. In 2001, when PJM optimized regulation and spinning reserves market together, and it became the answer service market, it changed the bid base. That's the market. And at that time, regulation B and regulation A were merged together into one regulation. In 2002, 2004, 2005, Allegheny joined PJM, and then a lot of the Western entities joined PJM. And if you go back to history, the RTOs initially started with the NERC subregions. So the original PJM, which some people call PJM Classic, was the Mid-Atlantic NERC region. It's called MAAC, M-A-A-C. And ECAR was kind of Ohio, and then there was another entity called Maine, which was Illinois and Wisconsin and a few states. So the reliability criteria varied by the NERC subregion. So the MAAC reliability criteria and the ECAR criteria and the Maine criteria did not necessarily match smoothly. So when Allegheny Power joined PJM, Allegheny Power was an ECAR. Now it's all one big happy family called reliability first, but Allegheny was an ECAR. So they had to have two different criteria for regulation. And when Comet, AP, Dayton, Duquesne, Dominion, and whatnots joined, they continued to have two different regulation markets. And you could not trade between the two because they were considered to be local. Just as we were talking about spinning reserves, you can't really deliver something from, let's say, Chicago all the way to Virginia. And then in 2005, PJM basically merged the two regulation markets and it became one happy regulation panel. And in 2005, as much as they merged it, they realized that you don't need 1.1% of your peak load. So starting in the later half of the year, they shrunk it first to 90%, then to 80%, and finally at the end of 2005, it was 70% of the on-peak and off-peak. Sorry, that's 2012. But it went down to 1% in 2005 from 1.1%. And that was for the peak load forecasts. In 2006, PJM allowed demand response to participate in regulation. In ERCOT, more than half of the answer terms are from load, but that was the first time that they did it in PJM. And then in 2010, batteries came up, so PJM defined what's called Regulation D. It was a much faster response than Regulation A. Now, there were a lot of issues, and so today, what PJM is contemplating is merging Regulation A and D back together again, so we only have one regulation. But you can see that it started with 1.1% peak load forecast by zone. In those days, the total PJM load was about 40 to 50 gigawatts peak load. In 2012, it was about 130 gigawatts. Today it's about 150 gigawatts. So you can see how it grew. But because the mandates went from 1.1 for every individual, so 9% peak load to 0.7% of peak load, which is now being reviewed again. You can see that on a per megawatt load basis, it has come down quite a lot. Anyway, so ancillary services, even though they're called ancillary, are changing constantly depending on the needs. So the question is, how much do you need? This is from an old study that I did back in 2010 for SPP, trying to figure out how to integrate wind. In those days, SPP had about 2% wind. So the study was, okay, what happens if the SPP wind penetration goes from the 2% to 10% to 20% up to 40%? Now, SPP nowadays, on an annual average, has more than 30%. And on an instantaneous basis, I think they went up to 92%. But in those days, people were afraid that if wind penetration goes above 10%, it's going to collapse the system. So we calculated how much it would do if there was the base case, which is what SPP was at that time, to 10%, 20%, 40%, and compared the flexibility needs and compare that to the total load. The total load of SPP in those days, which did not include the Dakotas, but it included Nebraska, was about 50 gigawatts peak load. So you can see that when you add up 40% of wind, the variability of wind in absolute value, it becomes very similar to load. Now, that the absolute value of load is much greater than the absolute value of wind. The chart on the left-hand side shows what happens if you add up the variability for each of the different balancing authorities that existed at SPP at the time. So you start with Northeast Kansas, Western Nebraska, and so on and so forth. The gold line second from the bottom is the variability if you aggregate them, because when wind is stronger somewhere, it can be weaker elsewhere, and it balances out. The blue line at the bottom is if you add it up all separately together. So we talked about how PJM aggregated the regulation needs, but something similar happens when you aggregate a larger zone. But these are some of the calculations that showed you how much do you need and what type. And in this study, it was only for wind, but obviously nowadays they have to take care of solar. Solar has a tendency of having minute by minute fluctuation compared to wind, which is more on a 10 to 15 minute fluctuation level. Because wind doesn't drop suddenly, even if it does drop suddenly, the wind turbine is still going to run for a minute or two. So the flexibility needs of wind is on a time scale slower than the ups and downs of solar, because just by a bird flying over your roof, your solar panel on your rooftop is going to stop generating for a microsecond or two.
So Bruce, maybe I should say, Can people hear questions? Or,
Yes.
maybe should save this question, but not to lose the continuity. So how is the total load measured?
But when you say total,
Where did the total load information come from? When I was a grad student, it was, you know how much generation you dispatch, you know how much you are planning to exchange with the others, and that difference is roughly total load.
That's pretty much it.
But this is very inaccurate.
Yes.
So when we talk about this variability of 1%, we don't even know total load.
Mhm.
Is that correct or not?
I think nowadays the load have the meters that are accurate. on-
Maybe at the substation level or which voltage level? I think that it used to be like that in EIA data, that's how they computed it.
But EEI data is supposed to be at the generator end when they report. it.
Right,
So it includes losses and whatnot, it's all the way up over there. So it's at the generator end.
Yeah, but that, plus minus what gets sent to the other
Yes.
area, that's what generation
Yes.
serves the total load. Is that where the only information about the load comes from?
No, if you look at the RTOs and maybe the utility filings, you actually see the generation and meter data and the load meter data.
Really?
Yes.
Now, these days, yeah.
Yeah, and the difference is losses, but then depending on the utility, for example, LADWP is really struggling to get the load side
Yeah.
meter up to date because it's old and it's crumbling. And as a result, their losses, including what we call non-technical losses, in other words, no theft, is combined is about 12%, which is fairly high. Now, if you go to the island systems, the non-technical losses could be up to 20 to 30%. And you see a lot of people with fishing rods, and I won't go further, but you can imagine what's going on.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
So the quantity of renewables is one thing, but the ramping is also one more thing. Again, this is a study we did in 2010. SPP is finally coming around to recognizing that, hey, we need something more than the typical regulation. This chart at the right-hand side shows the net hourly ramping as a function of the average day. The different shades of green is how much renewables you have. So the thickest green is the 40% wind. The lightest green is the base case, which is today. The dotted line in the middle is zero, but the white area in the middle is the case where you did not have any wind. Now, up there, on the left-hand side of the chart, you see two charts. One is, the one above is the case where you have a lot of, I can't see, you can, high positive wind, yeah. High positive ramping, the one below is when you have, low ramping or negative ramping. So you can see how it differs depending on the ramping of the wind and from the average day. So the ancillary services have to cover pretty much all these different scenarios. You can't just rely on the snapshot saying this is what it is on an average day, so I'm just gonna be prepared for that. So you do have to consider the up ramp and the down ramp and when they occur, how they occur. And again, this is only wind, but the ramping is a little bit easier to consider when you're looking at solar. But then when you're looking at solar, one more thing to consider is your geographical region of control. So California being along north to south system does not have much diversity in solar. When the sun rises, it rises everywhere at the same time. When the sun sets, it sets everywhere at the same time. If you look at PJM or MISO or SPP, which is relatively, PJM is probably the best example, where it's relatively long east to west, you can kind of offset that a little because the sun does not set at the same time everywhere. We went through this. So now why are we talking about ancillary services today? You probably know that everyone's trying to get renewables. And the federal government is saying 100% renewables for the energy industry by 2035. a lot of the companies out there have part of renewables as part of their ESG stuff. And if you just look at last year alone, PV was the biggest adder to the grid. There's 30 states with renewable portfolio standards that are state initiatives to add more renewables. And then there's more than 10,000 projects in the interconnection queue. The interconnection queue is where the generators sign up for interconnecting their generation to the grid. Without that, you can't connect to the grid. And there's 2,000 gigawatts of green resources. The total nameplate capacity that's installed in the US today is about 1,250 gigawatts. So you can see 2,000 gigawatts is about 1.5 or a little bit more than that. Amazingly, out of the 2,000 gigawatts, 1,350 gigawatts of generation is largely solar and wind. Solar has 950 gigawatts and wind has 300 gigawatts. Again, added together, you get 1,250 gigawatts. That's about the total nameplate capacity installed in the US today. And that's all in the interconnection queue today. 80% of them have this interconnection schedule within the next 4 years. Now that's not, we all know that's not going to happen, but that's how bad it is. And because of that huge surge, the average time it takes for a project to actually get to interconnection is about 4 years, sometimes longer. On the other hand, if you look at the distribution network side, the interconnection on the distribution network is a lot faster. So there's a balance between what happens in the transmission side of the world and the load side of the world, behind the meter side of the world. And that is causing a huge issue for various states when they're trying to get to more renewables, because if you have more on the distribution side, you don't need much on the transmission side and vice versa. But the transmission side is easier to control because on the load side, it's very hard to control. I saw New England recently did not know how much behind the meter solar they had because it's not their jurisdiction. And we talk about Inflation Reduction Act. There's a lot of money going into it. Part of it is for transmission, but there's also for renewables and storage and so on and so forth, which we can go into the appendix, but I think I'll just go light on that. And then there's new loads. We all talk about electrification. There's electric vehicles that people are aware of. There's HVAC that industrial processes are going to shift away from burning fossil fuel and going into electricity. But then there are other new loads. The two that I recognize here is the crypto load. These crypto mining loads can come in and out in 2-3 weeks, and they are, believe it or not, in the 100 megawatt to 200 megawatt size when it comes to the margins. So all of a sudden, as a utility, you're getting a request saying, "Hey, I want to connect a 200 megawatt load to your system in a month." That is a huge challenge for a utility. Furthermore, you don't know when they're going to disappear or what their profile is, so you actually need to provide backup for that. So in that sense, it's a reverse and it's not for the loss of generator, it's for the loss of load. So when the load goes down all of a sudden, how do you ramp down all your generators? What order do you ramp it down in? And what does it do to your system? So on and so forth. So that's becoming an issue. The marijuana, they're there too, and they are pretty small, but they're quite big when it comes to the capacity of those loads. And now the question is bigger better or bigger worse? On the one hand, if it's crypto load, bigger loads will have a tougher time moving away, so it could be better. But then a bigger load means your challenge is bigger, so it could be worse. It's very unclear, and these loads are highly cyclical. Depending on the crypto market or the value of crypto, Bitcoin, their activities can go up all of a sudden or can go down. But they're also flexible because they're not serving and load. If they can convince the local utility or the system operator that they'll provide flexibility in exchange for a lower rate, they'll do that because again, they're all about money. They're not serving any end customers. And so that becomes another challenge for that service side. What do you need from your own? Can you rely on others? How do you deal with that? What kind of contract do you sign with those? And so on and so forth. In the old days, utilities did do that when they had to buy certain services from their neighbors. So for example, Montana Power which after deregulation turned into an internet company, but now back to the utility business. Divested all the incinerators, so they did not have anything to provide regulation or spinning reserves. So they have contracts with DPA, PowerX, and a few others in that region to buy ancillary services without providing it on their own. But then later, they build their own CPs, combustion turbines, to deal with that. But it can go all over the place. So this is another challenge for not necessarily services, but the market as a whole. And the other problem is, if someone comes up with a 200 megawatt load, it's very hard to secure 200 megawatts energy capacity to serve that load. But as a franchise or a locally regulated utility, you do not have the rights to say no against any load who wants to take your service. And then finally, the markets and the perceived values have changed too. In the old days, or the current market, you got the energy portion, the dark blue portion, and the capacity portion. Now, this mix varies by unit type. If you're a peaker, it's about 50-50. If you're a nuclear plant, the energy portion is quite large. If you're a combined cycle, it's about 60 to 70%. And there's a little bit about flexibility and ancillary. As I said, in a typical asset evaluation, that's about 1 to 2%. But going forward, because of the EESG and everything else going on, energy value comes down quite a lot. The capacity value kind of remains the same, but the clean energy attributes and other stuff are all of a sudden coming up. And so the value that people see in the markets is also changing. And so all of a sudden you see the flexibility and ancillary services, which is bolded on purpose, grow compared to what it is today. So it could become a good opportunity for you to look into. And what's going on right now is that because FERC observed shortages in pricing, they basically ordered in FERC 719 from 2008 for RTOs to figure out what's going on, because oftentimes the prices are not high enough to cover the contingencies or the events that are happening. So New Mexico and PJM have proposed changing their operating reserve demand curves. That is an artificial way of increasing the price of ancillary services when the reserves are high. If you study the ERCOT market, you'll see ORDC. What they do is when the reserve margin is tight, the energy prices will go up to $8,000 depending on an administratively designed demand curve. ISO and MISO have implemented bidirectional ramping products that goes over 10 minutes, which is different from your traditional regulation, which falls within the 5-minute dispatch cycle. SPP is doing something similar to that. ISO is also trying to figure out what else they can do. And they're proposing another, what they call imbalance reserves. I am not very detailed about this one, but if you're interested, we can always do a research on that. And SPP is now considering a long-term uncertainty product that goes beyond the 10 years. And as I said, back in 2009 and 10, when do these guys know Pablo? Or well, my colleague Pablo and I did a study for SPP. We basically said, SPP, your weakest point is about 4 hours. That's when you're going to be facing the most challenges, and they're recognizing that now. Now, the change in ancillary service does not mean that it fits into the ancillary services. You can imagine that capacity markets can also incentivize flexibility, but today they don't. 1,000 megawatts of plant is 1,000 megawatts of plant. 1,000 megawatts can be one 1,000 megawatt plant that has a minimum generation level of 30%, so a swing of 700 megawatts, or it can be 10 100 megawatt units, again with a minimum generation of 30 megawatts, which means the flexibility also goes from 700 to 970. But the capacity market today doesn't reward that. If you look at California ISO, their 15% planning reserve is a sum of 6% for operating reserves and 9% for the unavailability of any assets. Now, if as the service needs are to increase, the capacity reserve margin should increase. And that formula is not really made clear in the other RTOs, but you can actually imagine that as the service increase will have an impact on the capacity market as well. So what are the challenges that we're going forward? When you're in a renewable dominant world, which we'll go into the next few slides, there's no energy price. And the marginal cost of wind and solar is assumed to be close to zero. So then does that mean that everything is paid by capacity? The renewables tend to crowd themselves. So in California, when there's ample sun or solar access today, adding an additional panel does not really help you secure capacity at all. So that's the capacity value of renewables is also kind of capped. Under that case, when you're getting close to zero from energy, close to zero from capacity, how is the generator or the developer of the generator supposed to make up its money? That's where ancillary service comes in. The other thing is, if you think about ancillary services, spinning reserve, non-spinning reserve regulation in the day and time frame is holding back capacity so you can serve it when you're called upon. When you're called upon in real time, that's selling energy. So ancillary services by nature is a combination of energy and capacity combined together, but in a shorter time frame rather than the hourly dispatch or the annual capacity market. Are there other things that have to be developed? In many of the studies that we've done looking at the future, the dispatchability, which is not a product that as it is today, becomes very important because no matter what system you study, there's always going to be 3 to 4 days when there's a renewable drought. There's no wind and it's cloudy and the solar panels. If you try to fill in that gap with storage, I think in a 5,000 megawatt peak system, we calculated to be $70 billion for securing 3 days. It would be much cheaper if you can have a few peakers laying there to serve those immediate times. Whether the policymakers understand that or not is a different issue. Who gets compensated for what product and who pays? That's also important. Ancillary services today are paid by the load. It's allocated to the load with different differences based on their peak load. But if you are the biggest generator and you are the one who's defining how much spinning reserves to secure, shouldn't you be part of that solution? And in the case of Singapore, they allocate the contingency reserves to the generator. The biggest generator is responsible for the difference between its capacity and the second biggest capacity, and it gets allocated. The second biggest generator is responsible for its capacity and the third largest generation, and gets allocated. So when generators interconnect, they get allocated generation interconnection queues, which ultimately will be paid by the load because the generators will transfer that cost to their TPAs or whatever else. But as an interim step, they pay. Should something like that happen to generators on the ancillary service side as well? One more thing is we talked about capacity markets, but an interesting example is Bermuda. Bermuda's capacity reserve margin is not set as a percentage, but it's set as the sum of the 3 largest units. And the philosophy is 1 unit is on maintenance outage, 1 unit is on forced outage, and then you need equal capacity of the third unit in case that third unit goes out, because that becomes the biggest contingency. So the sum of the 3 units is how they define the capacity reserve margin. It's logical. It's a little bit too detailed for the US larger systems, but you can actually see that there's different ways of calculating that. And the increase in ancillary service needs could become the potential largest contingency going forward. So that's another thought process that you may want to consider. I'll skip this slide. It just talks about the RPS that this different states have. These are from National Lab Studies and the Desire database. You can see how often they're revised. The lower half of this line chart shows how often they're revised. The upper black lines are when they were enacted, and so on and so forth. here's another interesting chart. The chart on the right shows Ontario between 2005 and 2017. Ontario added a lot of wind in that time frame, retired a lot of coal, and as a result, the energy price fell by nearly 80%. And more than a quarter of the time, the energy price is at zero or negative values. This is only in the recent history. What's going to happen in the future when you have more and more renewables is updating this question. The two charts on the left is taking the SP15 for California, I think I took the second Sunday in April for 3 different years, 2012, 17, and 20. Yeah. And so you can see that the day ahead market price that used to be relatively flat throughout the day because it's Sunday is all of a sudden filling in the famous California dot. Now, what happens in 2020 is that if I transfer that price into generation at the lower chart, the sun's going up along with wind is having a huge surplus of energy, and as a result, leading to negative prices during the day. But you can see the huge ramping needs price-wise between 5 p.m. and I think it's about 7 p.m. over there, when the ramping needs is about 12,000 megawatts within a few hours. That is an surplus need that you need today, but it can go worse as you add more and more renewables. One more thing is, renewables are more correlated. The 4 charts here show how the wind is correlated for SPP. The right-hand charts are showing how wind correlation factors. The above one is the average, and the lower one is the maximum. The 2 charts on the center show the time correlation. So by looking at the colors, you can see that the wind coming from the northwest going through to the southeast. Right now, we have this information for most of the systems, but we're not taking this into account in designing the market or as service needs, or even for load projections, which could be done. It is one of the type of information that people are aware of, but the market tends to ignore it, or at least market design does not reflect that. The type of studies that you need will also change going forward. In the old days, we used to run things called the integrated resource planning, IRPs. But if you look at what's going on in New York as an example, this time chart shows what the New York state policies are saying in terms of renewable. They're saying 9,000 megawatts of wind by 2035. Retire this type of unit, add that type of unit, add how much storage, add how much rooftop solars. So the blue box over there shows the New York annual consumption of 150 terawatt hours, roughly 20 terawatt hours were imported from Canada. And so the generation is about 130 terawatt hours. Out of that, nuclear is close to 40, hydro is about 30, wind and solar is about 4. So that adds up to about 2/3 of it. The remaining is gas and oil and others, which adds up to a little bit less than 60 terawatt hours. If you look at the going forward policies, the tier 1 renewables and the 9 gigawatts of offshore wind adds up to more than enough to replace the gas and oil in terms of energy. Now that doesn't mean that it's always going to be available, but in terms of energy, it's there. And you got 6 gigawatts of storage and 6 gigawatts of demand distributed energy resources. So your resource mix is already predefined by the government. You don't really need to figure out how much you need to add. The question is, when do you add it, where, and how? So, how do you get to that place? We know what the end goal is, we know what the resource mix is, but how do you get there becomes a more problematic issue in resource planning, which is quite different from in the past when you were saying, how much gas do I need? How much coal do I need? How much nuclear do I need? How much whatever else do I need? And when you're looking at this exercise, you can actually see that it is more of how much can the system accommodate these different types of resources because of the lack of or the existence of the flexibility to accommodate that. And the flexibility can come from generators, it can come from loads, it can also come from transmission, which we can talk about at a different time. These 6 charts are from a New York study. Upper right-hand chart shows how much GH greenhouse gas emission there is today. Electricity is at the bottom. You can see that electricity is only about a quarter of the total greenhouse gas emission today. Transportation is another 30%, and the rest is industrial, commercial, and residential consumption. The electric load by section is fairly small. It's about 150 terawatt hours, as we saw previously. It's roughly half and half between commercial and residential with some industrial. But in the future, when you're adding electric vehicles and converting the process of the electricity, it doubles. How that turns in terms of installed generation capacity is all of it is renewables and storage. What that does to the energy market is at the lower right-hand, left-hand corner. You see a lot of hours when the energy price is sub-zero. And that continues to increase because you're either curtailing wind, which means the marginal cost, which is the cost to provide the next megawatt hour is 0, or it's storage, but storage again. You're buying at 0, your round trip efficiency is 9% up, and it's also 0. Now, it's not going to be 0, but if there's competition, it's going to be close to 0. So energy prices are going to be very, very unfriendly to generators. In the meantime, you're going to have electric load increase quite a lot, roughly double is our expectation by 2050. Along with electric vehicles, industrial and commercial and residential processes that are relying on gas for oil nowadays, heating is probably going to go all into electricity. And that is one other way to figure out, okay, can we use those as reserves? In a study that we did for a rural Alaskan village, they had the need to install wind turbines. So instead of the 3 wind turbines that was needed for them to cover their electric load, we proposed to put 5. What they did with extra 2 was they introduced electric heating to the house. And when the wind died, they would shut down the heating. The heating shutting down for 10 minutes is not going to impact any human beings, and they always have the oil as backup. But because of that, their fuel oil consumption went down to half compared to before installing the wind turbines. So that's another way of utilizing other flexibility in the system as services. And finally, here's 3 examples of what would happen to the net load. If you assume 100% clean for New York with some nuclear and some renewable storage, you can see that the California dock is even going worse in New York, and it's more becoming like a Grand Canyon with a huge dip in the middle. If you have mostly clean and you overbuild wind, then it becomes tameable. But if you keep some of the gas, it becomes very close to today. So we're trying to go from where it is today towards that. And you can actually see the ramping need differs quite a lot. Today, the ramping is only needed on the positive side, but sooner or later it's going to go to the negative side. And as you add more and more renewables, it's going to be quite extreme. And so in that case, the most valuable product is not energy, it's not capacity, it's actually that ramping capability, which falls under answer service today. There are other considerations. Fighting transmission could be one of them. The patchwork between the states can be another one of them. Phase out the natural gas. The natural gas industry is obviously going to be against that. Thermal generation, how they make the money, how they recoup their investments, a big one. There's a lot, but it shows that it's a very good opportunity for anyone looking for problems to tackle, because Maria may have told you about the $1 million question, but this is more of a $1 billion question. Even as of today, it's going to go in the future. So some of the things that we want to figure out, we visited this earlier, but what are the reserve types that you need in the future, especially as the world goes crazy? What other changes can we apply? The changes has to be gradual, because remember, you can't stop electricity and say, we're going to be out of us for the next 3 days, but we're going to revamp everything. We can't do the work for electricity. Who gets compensated for what? That is very important. And how will it impact others? We kind of discussed this slide earlier. But those are the questions that are up there. And with that, I think I just want to open it up for thoughts and comments and discussions. Your likes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
That is the room or something.
Yes, that's.
Thank you very much, Bruce, a lot of food for thinking.
now people can see us.
So do we have any people remotely asking questions?
Let's see, I don't see anything in the chat, but if anyone wants to, they can unmute.
And ask them to type in the chat their question.
Or, yeah, you can unmute now and, or you can.
Okay, any questions here in the room, comments? Bruce was like your age when two of us met, right?
Yeah, that was 20-something years ago.
Bruce was working with us, yeah, and you didn't mention anything about your famous concept in masterpieces and how it relates to flexibility. I was hinting in my emails, but
Yeah,
do you
so
dare summarize in a few minutes?
my thesis at the time, because as I said, work order 880 was still being contemplated, order 2000 came out, and the concept of RTOs came out, was about how information should flow. And if you look at any market, for example, the stock market, the information flow is pretty fluid. And there's indices that the stock market says, collect from the different pieces and publishes. Anyone can understand what the S&P 500 is or Dow Jones is, right? There should be similar kind of information exchange for the energy market. That was my thesis 20 years ago.
You brought that from Japan, so.
Yeah. That
Were
was,
Japanese people thinking about doing it, or?
the Japanese market is interesting. They started with deregulation of the retail side. And the retail side deregulation started with industrial, then commercial, then residential. They did it on a voltage level of connection. And then they started deregulating the wholesale market, but what they did first was they established a capacity market without a wholesale energy market. And so they have a capacity market to secure long-term capacity, but they don't yet have a centralized wholesale energy market. And what they're considering right now is to keep the dominant utilities there, because the Ministry of Economic Trade and Industry wants a scapegoat in case it darks out, so that they have a phone call to call to whoever. But they're trying to make it loosely deregulated, so there's going to be a lot of bilateral contracts between the local service providers of the deregulated retail market and the centralized generators, which does not necessarily mean that it's from the utilities, but from others, and have local markets rather than a centralized market like the US.
Actually, when our market, standard market was designed, there were sort of two schools of thinking, one on West Coast, right?
Yes.
In Berkeley and Stanford, and the other one was, some of you might have heard me talk about this in class. The other one was Harvard and MIT. Centralized standard prevailed, and this is what it is now in wholesale market, everything centralized. And this thing that you're mentioning about multilateral, bilateral agreements in between people in the neighborhoods, sort of self-aggregating themselves, was a great idea, I think. And now we are returning to aggregation, but we'll see how it fits into the standardized market.
It could expand beyond the centralized market, especially as the distributed energy resources are becoming stronger and stronger. So if you think about computers in the 70s, there were mainframes that you have to be connected to, but nowadays no one has to IT in those mainframes. Everyone has a laptop that connects remotely to the internet, right? So that is one design for the market as well. We just don't know which way it's going to go.
And this vision about information sharing, wouldn't the information be binding? If you say you do something, is that binding or just information?
I don't think it has to bind.
It doesn't have to bind.
It could bind. The stronger the information is, it will have a flavor of binding. And what I mean by flavor of binding is NERC criteria or NERC mandates are not mandate, but in the earlier days, it used to be voluntary. But those standards, you did not have to really
abiding, but if you're the only one in the neighborhood not abiding by them, the other guys around you will not play with you, so you were kind of forced to abide to the criteria. Now they mandated it, so that force is gone, but in those days that happened, so you can have similar market self-adjusting mechanism that way too.
Guys, any questions?
I think Elaine has a question, right?
Elaine and
Sorry.
So, when you study tax law, sometimes you have to wait 4 years for projects to be
Interconnected.
interconnection. So from the IPP's point of view, can you explain what the process is like?
Yeah, so the first order 2003, which came out in 2003, basically said, here's the process for interconnection. And you sign up for it, the RTOs or the utilities do 3 types of studies to figure out how much it's gonna cost and what upgrades are needed. And then they will tell the developer, if you want to interconnect here, this is how much it's gonna cost. And the developer will say, I'll screw it or what, or I'll pay for it, and that's what happens. But in order to reduce time, what they came up with was called a cluster study. And our RTOs and the utilities, instead of doing the study on an individual basis, will collect the applications, let's say every half year or every year. And if there's 10 projects coming in, our RTOs will study all 10 projects and say, okay, for all these 10 projects to be interconnected to the grid, here's the upgrades that we need. And let me split the cost to you 10 guys based on the capacity or whatever other metrics. And then one of them will say, well, that's too much, I'm gonna walk out. Then the RTO has to redo the study for the 9 of them. And as a result, the cost will go up and there's gonna be further guys leaving and so on and so forth. So there's that study redo period, along with the choking of, we saw that it's 1.5 times the amount of nameplate capacity that exists today. People want to build the next 4 years. So there's that sheer volume that's causing the delay even further. So from the generator's perspective, they want to get things done faster, but they are kind of thinking, okay, it's out of our.
I also want to ask, like, is there a retroactive payment back to those like 10 guys? For example, last year they upgraded the transmission system, so that like the next 10 guys in the next year don't need to pay as much as.
So order 2003 basically says when in a vertically integrated utility, you pay your interconnection cost.
Yeah.
And then that gets paid back to you as a credit through your transmission. Now, FERC allowed the RTOs to have a different model. So what the RTOs did is they came up with this participant funding model, which is that when you as a generator, you pay for interconnection fees. Once you pay for the interconnection fee, they're not going to charge you for any transmission fees going forward. So you're free once you connect it. The idea of an RTO in a different way of thinking about the energy market is that once you're connected to the RTO, you can deliver your energy to anywhere you want within the RTO, just that the price is not guaranteed. So you make your decision based on the price. So from that perspective, once you're interconnected to the RTO, you can deliver to anywhere you want. And so you don't get the money back, but that's the entrance fee.
but Bruce, you cannot control point to point.
You cannot.
So what's going on?
Well, so that's the difference between the physical world and the conventional.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, the fact that FTRs are based on point to point, and we all know that the Kirchhoff law is not gonna let you send power from here to there, even if you wanted to.
So do you guys at Brattle think that the technical and economic signals will ever be semi-aligned? Who pays for what and who is paying for what?
That's usually the most great part, the who pays for what.
Yeah,
I mean, even in the industry that we discussed today, interconnection fee, ultimately loads pay for everything, but it is initially allocated to generators. And the service fee is all allocated to load directly. There's no interim step, so it's inconsistent in that sense.
I think you said it better.
Question, the enforcement of the market rules is happening on the regulation part, I mean, there's the rec A and rec B and rec D, right? So I understand that like in Castle now, we have rec A and rec D, but I just saw in the slide that in PJ now, they just merge rec A and rec D into one product. So what's the reason for that? Because if we expand we have more requirements for the regulation sources, that means sometimes the market will be larger, and perhaps we should kind of to give more benefits to this kind of fast or rapid response, right?
Yeah, so PJ came up with this performance metrics for Reg D, saying you have to be performing better to qualify for Reg D. And Reg D was originally designed for storage, but in later years, PJ allowed hydro to come into Reg D. And then all of a sudden, they're realizing that the Reg D share of the regulation was much larger than they anticipated initially compared to Reg A. And they realized that they don't need all that Reg D. How do you simplify it? And that's when they're starting to think, let's combine those two back.
Is it in the future that it just opening a funny base net? Because as I understand, rec A is kind of signal for 15 minutes, 5 minutes, and rec B will be 2 seconds, right? So really big.
The AGC signals in general are coming in every 4 seconds or so, regardless of the time. It's just the quantity that you can respond within those times.
Does anyone have any last question?
Yeah, so you mentioned that, a lot of people reduce the market price, so how do you consider the future energy storage will set the price, where it like significantly or somehow acting to the price for the participants?
So we don't know. That's one of the things that I wanted to put up in the discussion. And one of the thoughts is that there could be more longer term contracts that the utilities or the load sign directly, and therefore it becomes more and more of a bilateral type of market. That Maria was talking about, the California school of thought back 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah,
That's one option. We just don't know, but we do understand as a fact that the energy price and the capacity prices are probably going to tank, and the current structure that's based on the fossil dispatch model may no longer work. There may be a new product, and maybe that's dispatchability, which replaces capacity, or everything can be answered services, because if you think about it, capacity is an annual product, answered services is seconds a minute. If you look at what's happening in California, they have a proposal called the slice of the day proposal that is saying, we're gonna split the day into 24 hours. And the value of storage depends on how much you can respond in each given hour. So they're really, that's why it's called slice of the day, but they're really shrinking it down to a much smaller time frame.
I've seen, sorry.
And the other thing I talked to Daniel was, if you can clear the market, let's say on a minute by minute basis, because we're right now 5 minutes, then you may not need regulation.
Well, so that's where we don't have communications at that kind of scale.
Yes,
Right,
and that's
so
where,
that's really very expensive, I think.
but that's where the information flow that's instantaneously and response.
I was going to mention that in Europe, we did some studies for Azores Islands with real data. You could, people were proposing and accepting levelized cost rather than marginal cost, operating cost. And so you're only in, the value of what it would cost you to build for that period, plus operating cost, and that was zero. I remember on the island it was 88 euros or dollars per megawatt hour. And so that's pretty reasonable. So how, I guess, long-term contracts or levelized cost or something, I think they're easier to implement
I think they
minute
are
by
too.
minute, yeah.
And one of the things that deregulation in the US brought is that it shifted from the average cost to the marginal cost. Now, the benefit is that because of the market, it got rid of all the older stranded assets that the utilities wanted to hang on to. So that was a cost dropping element. It also reduced the cost of new goods. So those two contribute to lower cost. But when it comes to the pure cost of energy, going from the average cost to marginal cost meant if all else equal, it roughly doubled.
And it's true, there has been a lot of, even in PJM, data that people not building conventional generation, right? So margin is coming lower and lower. So maybe, we should pause.
Yeah, there's
Officially, and
there's
then
one
we-
last question.
Okay, sure.
And I think after that we should.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how a hybrid project, for example, wind storage would be compensated in a high renewable, high storage market. If wind gets out of market compensations, for example, or prices, what will happen for energy storage? And where do you think is the better sweet spot for energy storage for maximum benefit in terms of the potential service in like 2030?
So, there's two thoughts on it. One is what does maximizing storage mean? It could be maximizing for the system, which is different from maximizing for the private entity. It's, those two are different, objective functions, so I don't know which way they're talking about.
Yeah, Farhad, can you join us? Can you unmute yourself and maybe explain, give us a little from the developers? That's what they said. From the developers.
From the developers, no one has perfect source for full site, so that really depends on the developer. Even if you have two different,
Okay.
storage, owners today, they'll act differently to, the same market. And no one's gonna tell you why they did that, because that's part of their secret sauce.
Yeah. Okay, with that, we conclude today's seminar series and I guess this
This
semester.
is the end of semester.
This is the end of
This is
semester.
September again.
I hope you guys enjoyed it and I hope we will see each other again
In
next
September.
semester.
Thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Bruce.